The wind sweeping down from the sapphire mountains carried the scent of snow long before the first flake fell. Elara Vance stood on the ridge overlooking her homestead, the Montana wind whipping her black skirts against her legs. It was late September 1887, and the air already tasted like iron and ice. Below her, the cabin looked small and fragile against the vast, indifferent landscape. 6 months had passed since she buried Caleb on this very hillside. He had been 32, strong as an ox, yet a simple cold had turned into pneumonia and taken him in 9 brutal days. The community whispered that the widow Vance was losing her mind to grief, that the silence of the frontier was finally breaking her. They saw a woman staring at a cabin that was slowly killing her. But Elara wasn't staring at the past. She was calculating the future. The cabin Caleb had built was standard for the territory. Sturdy log walls and a conventional stone fireplace. But Elara knew the truth. The house was a sieve. The open hearth was a thief, sending 80% of their hard-earned heat straight up the chimney while she shivered just feet from the flames. It was the inefficiency that had weakened Caleb, and Elara refused to let the winter finish what it started. She walked back to the house, bypassing the front door and heading straight for the woodshed attached to the north wall. It was an 8x12 structure, currently filled with the cordwood meant to keep her alive through the coming freeze. To her neighbors, that shed was a pantry of warmth, a necessity for survival. To Elara, it was a blank canvas. Inside the house, on the rough-hewn table, lay Caleb's old journal. It was filled with sketches of European masonry heaters, massive thermal batteries designed to absorb heat and release it slowly for 24 hours. He had understood the thermodynamics, the elegant math of storing heat in mass rather than wasting it in the air, but he had never found the time to build it. Elara picked up the heavy sledgehammer near the back door. Her hands were thin, but her grip was iron. She looked at the woodshed one last time, not as a storage unit, but as the heart of a new machine. Taking a breath that misted in the frigid air, she swung. Crack! The sound of splintering wood echoed across the valley like a gunshot. She struck again, and then again. She was tearing down the only security she had, destroying the woodshed to build a monster of mud and stone. The neighbors watching from the road shook their heads, convinced the grief had finally snapped her mind. They didn't know she was declaring war on the winter itself. October in the Montana Territory didn't ask for permission. It simply took. The temperature hovered in the low 50s during the day and plummeted at night, turning the ground into a rigid, unforgiving mat of frost. For Elara, however, the cold was a secondary enemy. The true adversary was the mud. To build the thermal mass that Caleb's journals described, Elara had to become a laborer of the earth. She wasn't just stacking bricks. She was mixing cob, a prehistoric concrete made of 3 parts clay, 1 part sand, and long strands of chopped straw. The recipe was simple, but the execution was brutal. She had to mix it by foot. Day after day, neighbors passing on the wagon road would slow their horses to stare. What they saw confirmed the rumors circulating in the church pews. The widow Vance was barefoot in a pit of freezing mud, her skirts hitched up, stomping rhythmically like a woman possessed. Her feet were cracked and stained a permanent gray-blue from the clay. Her hands, once soft enough to mend lace, were now calloused and wrapped in rags to stop the bleeding. She was transforming 46 tons of earth into a monolithic structure inside the skeleton of her old woodshed, layer by agonizing layer. It was mid-October when the judgment finally rolled up her driveway in a fine carriage. Lydia Thorne, the wife of the town's wealthiest merchant and the self-appointed matriarch of the community, stepped down onto the gravel. She was flanked by 2 other women from the Ladies' Aid Society. They didn't bring casseroles. They brought an intervention. Elara paused, leaning on her shovel, her breath pluming in the crisp air. She knew what they saw. A gaunt, filthy woman destroying her property. "Elara," Lydia said, her voice dripping with that specific kind of pity that feels like an insult. She gestured with a gloved hand at the massive, damp wall of earth rising inside the shed. "This has to stop. We are all worried about you. You've torn down your fuel storage to build a tomb? It's not a tomb, Lydia, Elara said, her voice raspy from disuse. She stepped out of the mixing pit, wiping mud from her cheek. It's a battery. Lydia blinked, exchanging a confused glance with her companions. A battery? For what? You're freezing out here. You've destroyed your woodshed. Winter is weeks away, and you have nowhere to store wood. The Reverend thinks, we all think, that your grief has clouded your judgment. The fireplace wastes the heat, Elara explained, trying to simplify the physics that made so much sense in her head. I'm building a mass that will soak up the fire's heat and hold it. One small fire will heat this entire stone block, and the block will heat the house all night. It's efficiency, Lydia. It's survival. Lydia sighed, a sound of heavy, performative patience. She took a step closer, brave enough to almost touch the damp, cold wall of the structure. Honey, heat comes from fire. Fire burns wood. You can't heat a house with a pile of cold mud. You're going to freeze to death in January, and it breaks my heart to watch it happen. She reached into her purse and pulled out a card. The boarding house in town has a room. My husband says we can cover your stay for the winter, please. Come in from the cold before you kill yourself. It was a generous offer, wrapped in total condescension. Elara looked at the warm carriage, then back at her cold, gray creation. She thought of Caleb, dying in a drafty room that no amount of wood could keep warm. Thank you, Lydia, Elara said softly, picking up her shovel. But I'm not leaving. I have work to do. Lydia's face hardened. The pity evaporated, replaced by the stern disapproval of a frontier woman who had no patience for madness. Then may God help you, Elara, because when the blizzards come, physics won't save you. The carriage rattled away, leaving Elara alone in the silence of the encroaching evening. She looked at her feet, numb and bleeding, and then at the half-finished monster of mud. She stepped back into the pit and began to stomp. By late November, the mud had dried. The structure that dominated Elara's cabin was no longer a wet, shapeless mound, but a cured, pale gray monolith. It stood 8 feet tall, a massive masonry engine that seemed to swallow the room, smooth as river stone and cool to the touch. To the rest of the valley, the silence from the Vance homestead was deafening. There was no axe ringing in the pre-dawn light, no frantic stacking of cordwood against the porch rails, just a quiet chimney that barely whispered a wisp of steam into the steel-gray sky. Elara had developed a routine that defied every survival instinct the frontier had taught her. Each morning, while the valley temperatures hovered in the single digits, she would kneel before the tiny combustion chamber at the base of the heater. She didn't load a log. She loaded a handful. 5 pounds of kindling, sticks no thicker than her thumb, was all she fed the beast. When she struck the match, the fire didn't crackle lazily like a hearth. It roared. The draft pulled the flame sideways, sucking it into the insulated riser with a sound like a distant locomotive. For 45 minutes, the fire burned with terrifying, violent efficiency, turning the wood into pure heat energy without a trace of smoke. And then she let it go out. To anyone watching from the ridge, it looked like suicide. Lydia Thorne's house, a grand 2-story frame building, had 3 chimneys belching thick black smoke 24 hours a day. Her husband, Thomas, had hired men just to keep the wood cribs full, burning through a half-cord a week to fight the encroaching frost. But inside Elara's cabin, the physics of the insane structure were beginning to work their magic. The heat from that single, intense morning burn didn't vanish up the chimney. It was trapped, soaked up by the 46 tons of thermal mass like a dry sponge hitting water. By noon, hours after the fire had died, the masonry wall began to radiate. It wasn't the sharp, scorching heat of a cast-iron stove that burned your face while your back froze. This was different. It was a heavy, ambient warmth that seeped into the furniture, the floorboards, and Elara's own bones. The air in the cabin held a steady 62 degrees, a tropical paradise compared to the drafty fluctuations of her neighbors' homes. She moved through her day in a simple wool dress, while the women in town were already wearing their coats indoors. But as December bled into January, the atmosphere in the valley shifted. It wasn't just winter. It was a predator waiting to pounce. The signs were subtle at first, written in the behavior of the animals. The elk herds moved down from the high country earlier than usual, their eyes wide and skittish. The ranch dogs stopped barking and spent their days whining at back doors, desperate to be inside. Even the air felt wrong, too still, too sharp. The barometric pressure began to drop with a speed that made ears pop and old joints ache. Elara stood at her window on the afternoon of January 11th, watching the horizon. The sky to the north had turned a bruised, unnatural purple, a wall of clouds so dense it looked like a mountain range moving across the plains. The wind had died completely, leaving a vacuum of silence that felt heavy enough to crush the lungs. She knew what was coming. The Great Freeze. In the town below, panic was setting in. Men were frantically chopping the last of their wood piles, tarping windows, and huddling their families into single rooms. Smoke poured desperately from every chimney, a futile signal of their battle against the approaching zero. Elara turned away from the window. She checked her small basket of kindling, enough for tomorrow's burn. She touched the side of her thermal battery, still radiating the stored warmth of that morning's fire. It felt solid, dependable, and alive. She brewed a cup of tea, the ceramic mug warm in her hands, and sat in her rocking chair. Outside, the first gust of the Arctic front hit the cabin walls with a scream. But inside, the air remained still and warm. The test had ended. The siege was about to begin. The storm didn't arrive. It attacked. By midnight on January 12th, the thermometer at the train depot had bottomed out at 40 degrees below zero. But the wind was the true executioner. Screaming down from the north at 30 miles per hour, it drove the wind chill to 70 below, a temperature where exposed skin freezes in under 2 minutes, and where taking a deep breath can feel like swallowing broken glass. In the valley, the darkness was absolute, broken only by the shrieking wind that battered the homesteads like a physical hammer. Inside the Thorne residence, the grandest house in the county, the illusion of civilization was collapsing. Thomas Thorne stood in his parlor, wearing a heavy buffalo coat over 3 layers of wool, yet he was shivering uncontrollably. The house had 3 fireplaces, and all of them were roaring. He had been feeding them continuously for 12 hours, burning through his winter stock at a terrifying rate. It wasn't enough. The physics were brutal and unforgiving. The 90-degree difference between the interior and the lethal cold outside created a vacuum. The heat was being sucked out through the walls, the windows, and the roof faster than the fire could generate it. Frost was literally creeping across the expensive Persian rugs, white fingers reaching toward the hearth. Upstairs, the situation was critical. His youngest daughter, mere 6 years old, was huddled under a mountain of quilts, her lips turning a pale, frightening blue. She had stopped shivering. A sign Thomas knew from his trapping days meant hypothermia was setting in. "We're losing," Lydia whispered, clutching Thomas's arm. Her face was gray with terror. "The wood is halfway gone and the bedroom is 35 degrees. Thomas, if this wind doesn't stop, we're going to freeze in our own home." Thomas looked at his wife, then out the frosted window into the white void. Pride was a luxury for warm days. Tonight, pride was a death sentence. "I'm going to Elara's," Thomas said, his voice cracking. "She's dead, Thomas," Lydia sobbed. "That's Shack. She's been alone for months. She's definitely dead." "If she's dead, her cabin is shelter," Thomas snapped, grabbing his lantern. "And if she's alive, maybe she knows something we don't." The quarter-mile trek to the Vance homestead was a journey through hell. The wind knocked Thomas to his knees twice. The cold found every seam in his coat, biting into his flesh like wild dogs. He couldn't see the cabin until he was 10 feet away, a dark shape buried in a snowdrift. There was no smoke coming from the chimney. Thomas's heart sank. No smoke meant no fire. No fire meant death. He stumbled up the porch steps, his fingers so numb he could barely make a fist to bang on the door. He pounded on the wood, a desperate hollow sound against the wind. "Elara!" he screamed, the wind tearing the name from his lips. "Elara!" He waited, bracing himself to kick the door in, expecting to find a frozen corpse. Instead, the latch clicked. The door swung inward, and Thomas instinctively flinched, expecting a blast of freezing air. But what hit him stopped him dead in his tracks. It was a wave of heat. It wasn't the smoky, choking heat of a fireplace, nor the dry scorch of a stove. It was a solid, gentle wall of warmth, smelling faintly of dried herbs and summer earth. Elara Vance stood in the doorway. She wasn't wearing a coat. She wasn't wearing a shawl. She was dressed in a simple light wool dress, looking as if she were about to serve tea on a Tuesday afternoon. Behind her, the cabin glowed with a soft, golden amber light. Thomas stood paralyzed on the threshold, covered in ice, staring at her with wide, uncomprehending eyes. His brain couldn't process the data. It was minus 70 degrees outside. There was no fire in her hearth. Yet heat, impossible, life-saving heat, was pouring out around her silhouette. "Thomas?" Elara asked, her voice calm amidst the howling gale. She looked at his frozen eyebrows, his trembling frame. She didn't ask why he was there. She stepped back and opened the door wider. "Get inside," she said firmly. "Bring your family." The transition from the screaming void of the blizzard into Elara's cabin was so jarring that the Thorne family stood motionless in the entryway, shedding snow like statues melting in spring. Thomas carried his youngest daughter, her small body rigid with cold, and laid her on the rug near the massive cob structure. There was no roaring fire. There was no crackling hearth. There was only silence and a pervasive, enveloping warmth that defied all logic. It's hot," Lydia Thorne whispered, pulling her gloves off with trembling hands. She looked around the room, confused. "Where is the fire, Elara? How is this possible?" Elara didn't answer immediately. She poured hot tea from a kettle sitting atop the iron range. "The fire is gone, Lydia. I burned it this morning. What you're feeling now is the memory of it." The Thorne's youngest daughter, wrapped in blankets, reached out a tentative hand toward the gray, plastered wall of the heater. She flinched, expecting the biting burn of a cast-iron stove, but instead, she pressed her palm flat against it. Her eyes went wide. "Mama," the girl breathed, the color slowly returning to her cheeks. "It's like a living thing. It's hugging me." Lydia walked over and placed her hand on the wall. The surface was roughly 120 degrees, hot but not burning. It was a radiant, steady energy that felt like the sun baking a stone in July. She realized then that while her family had been frantically feeding a hungry beast that devoured their wood and gave nothing back, Elara had tamed the heat, trapping it in this mud tomb that was actually a fortress of life. The night wore on, the wind howling impotently outside while the thermometer dropped to historic lows. Inside, the two families sat together. The animosity and judgment that had defined the autumn melted away in the radiant warmth of Elara's insane invention. Lydia, the woman who had once offered Elara charity to save her from madness, now sat with her head bowed in humility. "We were wrong," Lydia said softly, looking at the thermal battery. "We thought you were broken by grief, but you were just ahead of us." "I didn't do it to be right," Elara replied, watching the steam rise from her cup. "I did it because I couldn't bear to be cold anymore. Sometimes you have to tear down the old ways to build something that actually works." By the time the Chinook winds blew in 3 days later, breaking the freeze, the world had changed. The story of the widow who defeated the Arctic winter with a handful of sticks spread faster than the flu. Elara Vance wasn't the crazy widow anymore. She was the most sought-after mind in the territory. By spring, she wasn't just planting a garden. She was teaching the town's men how to mix cob and calculate thermal draw. She had proven that resilience isn't just about enduring the pain. It's about being smart enough to change the rules of the game. Elara's story reminds us that true innovation often looks like madness to those who are stuck in the past. She had to destroy her security, her woodshed, to build her survival. Is there a woodshed in your life? An old habit? A safe job or a way of thinking that you're holding on to just because it's familiar, even though it's not keeping you warm anymore? What do you need to tear down today so you can build something better for your tomorrow? Let me know your story in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of resilience and American ingenuity, please smash that subscribe button and ring the bell. We bring you stories of the human spirit every week, and you won't want to miss the next one. Stay warm, everyone.